All right, so joining me now is Benjamin Yu of LastWordOnSports. How you doing today, Benjamin?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Excited to get into this episode. We're going to be going over Benjamin's big board, and then we're going to be doing some rapid fire March Madness predictions. So let's get into it, going over Benjamin's top 20 draft prospects this year. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we're going to go to Fanspo, where they have a big board creator that we can throw up on the screen for you guys. All right. So first prospect on your big board. I think everyone should have a good idea of who that's going to be, but you want to get into it, Ben?
Yeah, so I don't think it's any surprise that the first prospect on my big board and many others is Cooper Flagg from Duke. 6'9", could basically play any role on the court. Super athletic, super tall, super long. Is one of the most complete prospects in the draft this year. There were questions earlier in the season about his like offensive game and whether he could be like a primary initiator for for the NBA team that drafts him. I think as we've seen over the past few months, ever since the start of the new year, that he has quashed those questions like completely. He is the type of player that could change the fortunes of a franchise.
Yeah, most definitely. I think you summed it up, and he's really separated himself from other prospects in this class. I think towards the beginning of the year, there were some questions, like you were saying, about his ability to create his own shot a little bit and his 3 point percentage, especially. He was below 30% out of conference play, but then in conference play, he was shooting the three above 40%, which is just super impressive, and it just shows as time went on how comfortable he got as a shooter. And there's really no flaws in his game. And yeah, he's the clear number one prospect and really one of the best draft prospects in recent memory. If it wasn't for Victor Wembanyama, he definitely would have that claim as the best prospect in my lifetime, I would say. He's just a complete player, does everything on both ends of the floor. And I think it's just, he's really a no fail prospect in that area. Just the two-way impact to the all around impact, there's no flaws in his game. So he's clearly going to be the number one prospect in general. Obviously, the big talking point with March Madness now is his ankle injury. Are you concerned at all by that?
Well, for any ankle injury, even if he does come back, there is always the possibility of his performance dropping. His ankle, it just affects like so much about anyone's game, his shooting, his burst, this and that. So there's obviously concerns about his performance in the tournament. However, I think regardless of his performance, he will still be the number one pick. And from everything that I've heard, Cooper is a relentless competitor. He's going to play hard regardless of the injury. Duke is still must-watch basketball for anybody that's remotely interested in the NBA draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it could potentially impact him and Duke during the tournament just because ankle injuries can kind of be a reoccurring issue. But at the same time, it's not going to impact his draft stock at all. He's the clear number one prospect. And it's really interesting. I mean, there hasn't been a prospect outside of Wembanyama, like I mentioned, that really has this little flaws and is this complete. And it's super impressive considering he's only 18 years old. It's important to remember he did reclassify. He was originally supposed to be in that 2026 draft. So I think that's just another interesting thing to note. For his first month or so of college, he was actually 17 years old. So I think that just makes everything he's been doing just all the more impressive, really. And yeah, it's really rare to see a player this young and this complete. And yeah, just tons of upside and a really high floor as well. Is there a player in the NBA right now or all time that he sort of reminds you of?
Well, let me backtrack a little bit and say that I believe Cooper is either the youngest or one of the youngest players in the draft currently, and he is this good. So that just is testament to his completeness as a prospect. As as for someone who he reminds me of, a lot of people go straight to Andrei Kirilenko, and I would have to agree with that. He like even as a forward, he's such a good like defensive player who could play basically any role. If you want him to be defending on ball on the perimeter, he could do that. If you want him to serve as a weak side shot blocker, he could do that. If you want him to guard bigs, he could also do that. So like the Kirilenko comparison, I would say is apt. I would also say like offensively, he sort of reminds me of Jalen Johnson, who plays for the Atlanta Hawks. They sort of have that similar like on the ball, get downhill sort of driving game as well as that playmaking ability.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are two good ones that we're hearing a lot of. I think it was J. Kyle Mann who threw out a Scottie Pippen comparison for him, and that's one that I really like a lot. I think obviously that's a higher end comparison. Scottie Pippen's a Hall of Famer, top 25, 30 player of all time, but at the same time, Cooper's that good. And when you look at his defensive impact, ability to really guard any position, an on ball stopper, or as you mentioned, a guy that can really just wreak havoc off ball, I feel like that's what I see in his game, and then that point forward skill set as well. And he does have a very similar frame as Scotty, so I think that's a really high end comparison that I like for Cooper there. But yeah, moving on to your number two prospect, who do you got there?
Well, my first and second overall prospects have not changed since the start of the season. Obviously, the first one is Cooper, but the second one is Dylan Harper, the son of five-time NBA champion Ron Harper. He is of that big point guard archetype of player who could use his craft and physicality to just like break down defenses. He has a mid-range game that you could rely on. He's sort of he's a little streaky as a three-point shooter, but he is still in his game and something that I think that he could improve upon and eventually become somewhat consistent. And he's also a great playmaker, has great court vision, he makes excellent reads, and I seen him throwing some pretty impressive passes during his time at Rutgers.
Yeah, definitely. I think just with his size, playmaking ability, and scoring ability, he's really a complete guard in that area. And he's really separated himself in a class with elite guards. He's really separated himself as the best guard in this class. So I think that's just a sort of a testament to how good he is. Especially when you look at this Rutgers team, they were obviously very disappointed. But Harper's stock never really wavered, and he was always sort of considered that number two prospect by most people. So I think that's just a testament to how good he is. And I think he's another guy that just has an ideal combination of a high ceiling, but also a really high floor as well. I don't really see a scenario where he gets into the NBA and he's not a super productive player. Obviously, making that transition as a guard is a little bit more difficult, so it might take a little bit more time. We sort of see that with guards a lot of the time, but nevertheless, I think ultimately he's going to be a really productive NBA player and multi-time All-Star. I think he has a ton of potential. Do you sort of view Cooper and Dylan in their own tiers in a way? It's like Cooper tier one, and then Harper tier two, and then everyone else is sort of maybe a little bit below those guys, or how do you view that?
Yes, for Cooper, definitely he's like well above any other prospect in this draft. And then there's Dylan and guys like that we're gonna be talking about real soon, like VJ Edgecombe, Kasparis Jakuchonis, Ace Bailey, Kama Malawach. They're sort of like in a separate tier below them. Uh, they just been like well and above the two best prospects in the draft. Even after like Dylan Harper, I believe he sustained some sort of injury. I don't quite recall what injury that was in the middle of the season. And right around that time, he also caught an illness that made him lose weight, and it sort of affected his play for the rest of the season. Even after that sort of diminished play, he's still the number two overall prospect for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a really good point there, and you summed that up nicely. In terms of fit, is there a specific team that you're looking at for Harper that would be the best fit? I feel like a lot of teams in the lottery might either have an established guard, or then there's a handful of teams that really just need that star. So is there a certain team that you're looking at for Harper as that sort of best fit?
Well, on my mock draft I released a few days ago, I had him mocked second to the Utah Jazz. As of now, the Jazz has moved up into the first slot for the number one overall pick. So obviously there's going to be changes there, but I do believe teams like Utah, the Washington Wizards, and the Pelicans could really use a sort of lead guard to really spearhead their offense. They don't, none of those teams really have someone like that. Obviously, for the Utah Jazz, they do have Keontae George and Isaiah Collier, but I don't really see them as someone you could say, hey, we're gonna give you the keys to the offense. You could go from here. You're gonna be like a cornerstone of the franchise for years to come. So I think like a team for Utah, if they somehow drop back down into like second or below, they should like they are like the prime Dylan Harper spot.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. They're just sort of looking for that franchise cornerstone there, and that's what Harper would really be. And then, like you said, they do have two really solid young guards, but I don't really view them as those future star types necessarily. And they can also coexist next to Harper just with his skill set and their skill set as well. So I think that's a really good point there. And I also like the Pelicans pick. I think the Pelicans would be a really good fit. DeJounte Murray's probably going to miss all, if not most of next season because he had that torn Achilles injury. So then just getting another point guard in there who really has that star potential would be huge for them, and I'd be fascinated to see him play next to Zion Williamson. I think that would be a really fun duo, assuming they do keep Zion this offseason. So I like that pick as well. I do also really think it just comes down to who gets the number two overall pick. Sort of like with Flag, I feel like Flag's locked into that one spot, and it sounds like from what you think and from what I think as well, Harper's really locked into that two spot. So definitely depends on how the lottery shakes out there. All right, let's get into your number three prospect. Who do you got there?
So my number three overall prospect for most of the season has been Ace Bailey. However, like I would say in combination of Ace sort of not performing as highly as I thought he would, and this guy improving upon his sort of weaknesses as the season has went on. My number three overall prospect is VJ Edgecombe from Baylor. So VJ, he's like 6'5". He's incredibly athletic. He's easily one of the best guard defenders in the draft. He utilizes his athleticism amazingly well. He could stay in front of his man. He could provide some weak side shot blocking. Great at reading off ball actions to like pick off passes. Loves to get out into transition. He's such a amazing dunker. I will say that some of his his like rim numbers like aren't as great as like you would think, but he has also improved as a shooter, like as a three-point shooter, which has opened up the lane a little bit for him. So in combination um with his defensive potential plus his offensive improvement, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't be the third overall prospect.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely some valid points there. I feel like most of the season he was sort of around that somewhere between like 3 and 5 range, but he's really elevated himself. And I do think most people, if you look at their big boards, they would probably have VJ within the top three at this point, or worst case down at number four, something like that. So I think that's
Yeah.
very reasonable. And I think just with his two-way impact, I think that's a huge selling point, especially how few two-way guards there are in the league. Really, a lot of guards have weaknesses defensively, especially if they're a little bit undersized. But with VJ's size and athleticism, that's never going to be a weakness in his game. And just that ability to make a two-way impact is huge. And then, as you mentioned, the shooting improvements are also massive. How much of his NBA impact and sort of potential do you view hinging on his jump shot translating, or do you feel like he's going to be sort of a star player regardless?
So for VJ, I do think a lot of it hinges upon his ability to improve as a shooter. Just having that ability to like spread out a defense to force them to like play up on him will allow him to use like leverage his athleticism a lot more. Though I will say for VJ, something that I'm not sure will like come around for him is his ability to be like a primary shot creator. I don't think that's something that's going to happen for him. But I will say his shooting still needs to improve, and he still like needs to like get better at rim finishing, get better at getting into the lane, even though he's already pretty good at that. But overall, he still needs to improve his offense. But I don't think he will ever become like a primary initiator or primary offensive player. But it still, for someone with his two-way impact potential, he's still gonna be within that top five, top three range.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even in a draft class like this that does have a lot of star power, once you get outside of that top two, really, you might be looking for those awesome number two complementary players. And there's really nothing wrong with that at three. And also just VJ's ability, sort of as you mentioned, he's more so that secondary shot creator. That can just be huge for a team that already has an established piece next to him. Or at the same time, he can just fit in with more lineups because he might be a little bit less ball dominant. So I think that's a really good pick there. And yeah, really exciting prospect. And someone to definitely watch in March Madness. Obviously, they're playing Mississippi State in the first round, so that game should really be a battle. But if they're able to win that, it would set up a matchup with Cooper Flag and Duke. So that could be a really exciting game. So definitely rooting for Baylor in the first round just so we get that excited draft prospect matchup there. Moving on to number 4. Who do you got there?
Number 4, I have Kasparas Yakuchonis from Illinois. I think he is one of the best offensive players in the draft this year, one of the best point guards in the draft this year. His ability to play on and off the ball, his ability to score on all three levels. He has great like feel and is a high processor of the game, and it sort of manifests itself in his ability to be a playmaker for others. I've seen him throw some pretty incredible passes. He has been sort of like stagnating or like slipping a little bit these like past few weeks or so, but I would still have him at number 4 just due to the completeness of his offensive game. He's not like a great athlete or defender or anything like that, but I will say I think his offensive potential it outweighs his sort of flaws. Like Yakuchonis, he sort of reminds me of Austin Reeves, sort of like that crafty sort of guard that who could like just help run an offense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, his playmaking is really incredible, and pairing that with his size and ability to get rebounds, score inside, it's really huge. And prospects like that really do tend to succeed at the NBA level. I will say between his jump shot and then sort of as you mentioned defense and athleticism, I do think there's a little bit of concern there, but at the same time, with his playmaking and scoring prowess, I think he just has tons of upside and he definitely belongs in that top 5 range. What would you say is your biggest concern with his game? Would you say it's more so the jump shot or the athleticism?
I don't have any concerns about his jump shot. I think he will shoot it at the NBA level. His shot looks good. I will say that his numbers may not be impressive in college. I think partially for that is that he takes a lot of really tough shots for his team because he is the primary initiator for Illinois. I think that's why his like 3-point shooting numbers aren't as great as one would think. But I do think he will shoot it in the NBA. I feel like his bigger issue is that he's just not a great athlete and he isn't a great defender. We've seen guys like the aforementioned Austin Reeves. He's not an athlete. He's not a great defender either, but he's like the third best option for LA. So we've seen that sort of archetype of player work, and I think Kasparas will fit into that archetype.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point you made, sort of about guys that not aren't necessarily great athletes really succeeding at the next level. I feel like the last 5 or so years we've seen a lot more prospects succeeding despite sort of their athletic challenges. Even, I mean, to a way extreme extent, like Luka Doncic, I remember coming into the league, everyone was questioning Luka's athleticism, and obviously he turned out to be a top 3 player in the NBA. So I feel like guys like that really shut down some of those concerns. So I think that's a really good point there. And I do think he's going to have a very successful career, just sort of as we discussed with his playmaking ability and his size, ability to run an offense. He could either eventually blossom into a star level player or sort of be that awesome complementary piece, sort of like you said with an Austin Reeves. And just with his size as well, I think it's important to note that he could either run the point guard or shooting guard position. So he's really a true combo guard, and that sort of versatility is definitely huge for his draft stock and NBA potential. All right, who you got at number 5?
Well, at number 5 is Ace Bailey from Rutgers. While he did fall from number 3 for me, I wouldn't say he will fall like past the top 5. For Ace, he's like 6'10", can really shoot the ball, has some very interesting defensive tools. Like I would say that while he has the athleticism, he has the shooting, he has the size, he has the defensive tools. The biggest problem for me, or the biggest problems for me with Ace Bailey that made him drop to 5 are his shot selection and his defensive awareness. For Ace, he can struggle to get to the rim, which forces him to take a lot of tough shots that I would not advise many people taking. And for on defense, you can't believe the amount of times I've seen Ace Bailey get caught on a backdoor cut. He's just like ball watching, not really guarding anything. Like those two things, he like really, really needs to work on. But like as I said before, his shooting He has a beautiful shot. He has great defensive tools. While I did say that his defensive awareness is really not great, he has like flash potential as like sort of a weak side shot blocker. And when he's locked in defensively, you could see that, oh, like this guy could be a top three pick if he really like locks in.
Yeah, definitely. I think Ace, outside of Cooper and then Harper, I feel like he has the highest upside in this draft. He might even have a higher upside than Harper, but like you said, it's really about improving his shot selection. I think that was a huge point of criticism throughout his time at Rutgers. And then defensively, as you mentioned, sort of those lapses. And I do think it's going to be really important where he lands. I think he's going to have good talent around him, and I think that will really benefit him. And at the same time, I think he's a really he's a player that can play on or off the ball, so I think that will also benefit him at the next level
Yeah.
because he can really fit into a lot of different teams. I look at the San Antonio Spurs as a really potential dream fit for him. Obviously, playing next to Victor Wembanyama and then De'Aaron Fox and Stephon Castle. That would be an awesome situation, but he's a guy that could provide them a little bit more front court size at that forward position and then really space the floor out and play off ball. So I think that would be really an ideal fit. But there's a lot of other teams, even if you look at like potentially like a Washington, depending on how the lottery shakes out, that he could really fit nicely in with. But yeah, I think he's a really interesting prospect to me. Definitely one of the more divisive prospects. Some guys
Yeah.
will probably have him number three on their big board. Some guys might even I've seen just on Twitter and stuff like that having him outside of the top 10. But I
Yeah.
would say he's a guy I'm pretty high on. Just that shot creation upside, and then sort of I do think he does have a higher floor than people will give him credit for, just because that spot up shooting is always going to translate to the next level, and he just has great size. I feel like even if there are some questions about his defense, guys like that at the next level, just based off his frame and his length, really, they do end up being high quality defenders at the next level. I could see him becoming more like a Jaden McDaniels as a lower end player who's really that spot up shooter and plays great defense. So I think he does have a higher floor than a lot of people will give him credit for. The other thing that gets talked about him a lot that you didn't bring up was playmaking. A lot of people question his playmaking, which is
Uh,
definitely a valid concern. But two things I want to point out: he's a 6'10" shot created forward. I don't really care if he's not the best playmaker in the world. When you have all those other skills and then the defensive upside, I don't think that's going to matter as much, especially if he's in a situation where he's going to be playing more so off ball. I'm not too concerned about the playmaking. I don't know where you land with that, but I think that's another sort of interesting thing to know. And then the other thing there is playing next to Dylan Harper, who's such a great playmaker. You're really never gonna be able to show off that playmaking ability, even if that's something he does possess. So yeah, where do you land with that? And then the other question I want to ask is, do you think this Rutgers team, obviously they have or they had Harper and Ace, but at the same time the surrounding talent wasn't really all there. Do you think that hurt his stock a little bit?
well, to answer the second question first, I would say yes. Like that Rutgers team really didn't have anybody outside of Harper and Bailey. But to go back to the first question, I will say like if you're looking for Ace to be that sort of primary initiator on the offensive end, then I would say that the lack of playmaking is a big concern, like a really big concern, because like from everything I've seen from Ace, he just doesn't pass the ball. Like he will take the hardest shot possible before he will pass the ball. Yeah, I would say he has improved slightly as the season has gone on. Like you could see him starting to pass a little bit more, but like if you are looking for him to be that primary like that first option or primary initiator, then the lack of playmaking is a huge concern. But if you view him as more of like the second or third option, maybe it's not as much of a concern. Maybe it's more like a Michael Porter Jr. type where he's more of like like the ball gets to him and he makes the shot sort of player. In that case, then maybe it's not as huge of a concern, but still, I would say it is a concern, but depending on how you view him, it may be higher or lower as a priority.
Yeah, for sure. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I really like the MPJ comp there as well. Sort of with that in mind, is there a team that you'd prefer him to land with, and then is there a team that you'd prefer him not to land with, just based off the surrounding talent? What's sort of your best and worst fit for Ace?
Well, for worse, that's easily the Charlotte Hornets. I don't think he should ever. I think the Hornets would be like the worst place for him. No, number one, I don't think his fit with Brandon Miller like is great. I think there's too much skill set duplication there. Number two, I don't think they're like the team that could really mold Ace into being that serious player that he could be. Yeah, I would not send him to Charlotte. I think that's the worst fit possible. As for the best fit possible, I do kind of like him going to Brooklyn in the sense that I think Jordi Fernandez, their like new head coach, could really like help him develop into being like an amazing player. I also like the Spurs, like getting him to the Spurs, but I don't know how likely he will get to their pick as it stands right now. Let me see. The Wizards wouldn't be a bad pick either. In terms of like sort of like fit in that sort of case. And I would say that before the trade deadline, the Raptors were my pick for the place that Ace Bailey should go. But since the trade deadline, they traded for Brandon Ingram, and I don't know why they did that. I feel like they should have just just not like just grab picks and then go from there. And before the trade deadline, I would say that like Ace Bailey would fit perfectly next to Scotty Barnes. He would be like not asked to be like this primary initiator. He would be like the second or third option, and he would just feast off of Barnes's playmaking. But after the trade deadline, the lines are it's a little bit blurry there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all those teams. I feel like Charlotte would be sort of a disaster, and then I like Washington as well, and then just sort of how he fits in the Nets offense, like you mentioned with Jordi Fernandez, is super intriguing. We'll see how they sort of build this offseason. I feel like they could be a team that adds a lot more talent, and they do have a lot of picks in this draft as well, so I think that would be a really good fit, and it seems like that organization really knows what they're doing. And yeah, the Raptors, I agree, that would have been a super interesting one before the Brandon Ingram trade. With Ingram there, I don't think that really makes a lot of sense for them, and I think that would be kind of a weird fit. And definitely agree. I think that trade was a little bit of a head scratcher. I don't know why they want to just try to commit to the rebuild, add some more young pieces. I feel like Ingram is a really weird fit there, and we still haven't seen him play a game for the Raptors yet. I don't think we will see him play this year.
Yeah.
Interesting to see how that will play out going forward and what they do in the draft. But yeah, let's move on. Who you got as your number six prospect?
At number six, I have Colin Malawak from Duke. So for Common, I would say that he's probably like the rawest player in the top 10 for me, but he also I would say he has like one of the highest upsides. He's like 7'2" with an enormous wingspan. He's deceptively very, very quick for his size. He has that potential to be like both as that sort of like rim protecting center that sort of like guards the paint, and also he flashed some potential at being able to guard the perimeter. On the offensive end, he's super raw there. He's not like he doesn't post up, he doesn't really have like a sort of like a jump shot or a floater or anything like that. He's mostly like a cut and roll big. But I would say that his like defensive potential, like if he could develop into being like someone like Derek Lively or like like I think Rudy Gobert may be a little bit too high of like a ceiling, or he's going to be a Hall of Famer, but if he could develop into that sort of rim protecting big who could also guard the perimeter, that's like any team would want that.
Yeah, definitely. He's a super interesting prospect for sure. I think just with his archetype, I do think even though you did say he was more of a raw prospect, and he is, I believe he's only 18 still, so that definitely makes sense. I do think just with that archetype though, that role that he's gonna play in the NBA is just that rim running big, that shot blocker, rim protector, guy who grabs rebounds. I do think that floor is pretty high despite sort of his rawness on offense. So I'm pretty high on him as a prospect. And I think just any team that needs a center should really be looking at him. And it's just sort of a simple role to play in the NBA. And I think he's going to be very successful. But then he also does have that upside if that offense ever develops, which is certainly possible just given his age and that he didn't start playing basketball until I believe around 14 or 15, something like that. So I feel like guys like that are always going to have a high level of upside. And yeah, just he's a guy that could really bump up his draft stock even a little bit more, even though he's pretty high in most of these boards, just with a big run in March Madness. And I think we're
Yeah.
really going to get to see a lot of that two-way potential there. I definitely like the Lively comp. I think that's definitely one that makes a lot of sense. And we saw a couple of years or last year how Derek Lively was able to have that huge impact as a rookie on that Dallas Mavericks team. So I think that's a really perfect comparison, really. And yeah, are there any teams specifically that you think would be just a perfect fit for him?
Well, I would say that teams like Chicago could really use him. Chicago just needs talent. They don't really have anything for the future outside of Montas Buzelis. I would think that like common with Montas Buzelis, that would make a very interesting sort of defensive front court. So I like the Chicago's like him going to Chicago. The Raptors will also could also be an interesting pick there because like are they keeping Jakob Poeltl as their starting center? Is that someone that they want to like keep building with? Yeah, I like those two teams for him.
I think those are two great ones because, sort of like you mentioned with Podol, but also with the Bulls, they have Vucevic. So he could really learn behind those guys for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, something like that. And then he could really take the reins over as a starting center. And I think it would be good for his development just to be behind a high quality center and still at the same time get a lot of quality reps in there as that backup center as a rookie or maybe even into his second year or something like that. So I think those are two great picks and they would be great fits for him. Let's move on to number seven. Who you got there?
Number seven, I have Colin Murray Boyles from South Carolina. He is a sophomore and he is one of the most productive players in college basketball. Great two-way play, excellent defender. One of the top defenders in the class. I would say maybe like even on Cooper's level, he could basically fill any defensive role that you could ask from him. And also he's a great finisher at the rim. He could create his own shot. He's not a great shooter, and I don't know if he will ever become a shooter. The potential is there, and if he does ever become a shooter, that's a star player right there.
Yeah, absolutely. He's definitely one of my favorite prospects in this class. I definitely wanted him to declare for the draft last year just because it was a little bit of a weaker draft class, and I thought he had a chance to sort of be in that lottery range. But at the same time, I think coming back to school wasn't a bad decision, and I think he did boost his draft stock a little bit. He's one of the top players in this sort of loaded class. And yeah, just super intriguing player, as you mentioned, super versatile and impactful on defense. That type of archetype is always going to be one that I'm drawn towards. And then just the connected playmaking as well is really intriguing to me. I think he sort of gives shades of Draymond Green in that sense, just with
Yep.
his playmaking and defensive abilities, and then he's a really good rebounder as well. Obviously, the jump shot's the big question, but at the same time, when you bring so much to the table between your defense, playmaking, rebounding, finishing inside, I don't really care if you're not the best shooter in the world. I think you just bring too much to the table, and at the same time, if that jump shot ever develops, you're going to be a star for sure. So one of my favorite players in this class, and I think it definitely depends on where he goes. I think he's definitely one of those fit guys because if you're a total rebuilding team and you don't have much talent around him, it's going to be a lot harder. And I think that's what we saw sort of at South Carolina. They were one of the worst teams in the SEC. Didn't make the tournament. So I think that did hurt him in some ways because he wasn't playing around much talent. But at the same time, we got to see how much he can do with little talent around him. So I thought that was a super encouraging sign. What do you make of his season at South Carolina? And do you think he would have been even higher on your board had he played with a more talented college team?
I think for Murray Boyles, he basically had as good of a season as you could reasonably ask for with that roster. I do think if he had like a better team, he would be even higher. Like if he was on a team that's currently in the tournament right now, he probably would be like number six for me. Yeah, like he like you could not ask for more for someone who's a sophomore who came back to raise his draft stock even further.
Yeah, definitely. And then looking at his scoring numbers, he went up from 10 points a game to 16 points a game, which is a pretty sizable jump. And I think that's sort of encouraging and it shows that he really does have that star upside potentially. But worst case, he's just going to be a super impactful jack of all trades role player. So yeah, super exciting prospect. Super excited to see where he ends up landing in the draft. Yeah, definitely one of my favorite guys. Yeah, just the versatility there is just so impressive and just really fun to watch there. So yeah, I really like that pick, and I'm glad you had him pretty high on your board. Who do you got next up at number eight?
Number eight, I have Trey Johnson from Texas. Trey Johnson is one of the most electric scorers in the draft this year. a great shooting form. He could really knock it down from the mid range and from three. He can struggle at times to get to the rim, which sort of kind of scares me a little bit. While he has improved as a playmaker over the course of the season, I would still say that it like he will still need to like improve even further from what he is or like he has already shown because he doesn't really pass the ball like a lot. I wouldn't say that he's as bad as Ace Bailey, but it's something that is a work in progress for him. And his defense is kind of is not it's not great. But that sort of scoring prowess that he has, he's also probably one of the best shooters in the class. Like that combination of scoring is someone that is deserving to be in the top 10. Yeah, like any team that needs someone that could really put the ball in the basket, he's the player to go for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you summed it up nicely there. With that level of shot creation, I have a hard time foreseeing him not to be a high quality NBA player. I feel like that's one thing that always translates, and that obviously has a strong connection to your upside as a player, just being able to create shots like that at such a high level. Super impressive what he's been able to do as a freshman, really sort of carrying this Texas team into the tournament as just their main scoring option. And he did lead the SEC in scoring, which is super impressive as a freshman, especially in such a loaded SEC. I really hope their first four teams, so I really hope they're able to get into the tournament and potentially set up a matchup with Illinois, which would be a great prospect matchup. And who knows, maybe go on some sort of run. They obviously played in the toughest conference in basketball this year, so I feel like that sort of hurt them a little bit. But I do think overall this team's pretty talented, and I think Trey Johnson's really at the center of that with his elite creation, and then he also has really good positional size. At
Yeah.
6'6", he could probably gonna play the two guard, but he could also maybe even develop into more of a point guard. He almost reminds me of a bigger Cam Thomas in some ways. So I think that he's a really intriguing player, and yeah, like you said, I think it does definitely depend on where he ends up in the draft. But at the same time, with that level of scoring, you're really going to be able to fit in anywhere. I think he could maybe be a potential franchise cornerstone. He definitely has a ton of upside where he's going to be drafted. At the same time, he does have a really high floor just because of his shot creation. Worst case scenario, I see him as sort of that elite energy guy, six man of the year type of guy off the bench, just a microwave scorer. Best case scenario, I could see him being a legit star. Where do you sort of land with his floor and ceiling?
I do feel like his floor is just like sort of like a utility shooter, someone who could just come in and if you need them to like knock down threes, he could do that. So someone sort of like Doug McDermott, especially if like he gets really picked on defense, if like none of the playmaking comes around, if he can't really get to the rim against NBA defenders, I would feel like that's his floor. Just simply because he is an amazing shooter, I think he will still have a role, but if none of those things come around, that's where I like feel like he would be. As for his ceiling, I feel like if the playmaking comes around, if he can get to the rim, if he even becomes just like an average defender, like I feel like he could be like someone. They're not exactly like the same player, and I do sort of like that Cam Thomas comparison. But the player that I feel like he could be compared to is sort of like Malik Monk. Monk is a way better playmaker. Like he could run the point. I don't think Trey Johnson could ever run the point, even if he does improve as a playmaker. But sort of like that sort of scoring aspect to Malik Monk's game. I feel like he that Johnson could replicate that.
I really like that Malik Monk comp. I hadn't heard that one before. I think that's a great one. Just sort of that microwave guy who can just get buckets in bunches and then create his own shot. Really good shooter. Just complete package offensively. I think that's a really good one. And Malik Monk is just one of the more entertaining players to watch in the league too. So I think that's really a really solid comp there. Who do you got as your number 9 prospect?
Number nine, I have Asa Newell from Georgia. For Newell, he is a 6'11" forward who has excellent like physical tools. He's long, he's athletic. He He's like quick for his size. I feel like he could be like an extremely versatile defender, especially if he could like get some more like strength or weight on his frame, so he could guard bigger players. If he does that, I feel like he could be like a potentially like maybe like a two through five defender. My sort of questions with like Ace's game is more like on the offensive end. Like he's a great finisher. He could roll and cut and catch lobs, and he sort of has the potential to be a shooter. It's not quite there, but you could see that there are flashes of him being able to shoot. My question is like, what is he going to be like offensively at the NBA level? Is he going to be more of like that sort of like center, like big sort of like offensive player where he's more, cut and roll and lob, or is he more like a forward wing where he's more perimeter based? He's also not a playmaker at all. That's not what you like need him to do. But I feel like that's something worth addressing. But yeah, like what is he going to do offensively at the NBA level?
Yeah, I think that was a really nice summary there. Just the defensive impact, one of the better and more versatile defenders in this class is really his selling point, and then have to see how the offense comes along, and that will be really crucial for his development. He has shown shades of being able to shoot. He shoots about two or three threes a game, not necessarily at a high clip, but for a big man in college, I think that's pretty solid. And we've seen guys with similar percentages be able to develop into more of that stretch four, stretch five type. That could be huge for him, obviously. And yeah, I think it's also interesting to think about the versatility, being able to play either the four next to a really big five, sort of like a Wembenyama type. I think Spurs again, that'd be another really ideal fit for him. Or he could really play that center position and eventually really blossom into a full time center. Where do you sort of see him positionally? Do you think he's going to be more of that full time center, or do you think he's always going to be sort of playing next to another big?
I feel like as it stands right now, especially going into his rookie year, I feel like he's going to be more of a four because he just doesn't have that sort of strength or weight on his frame. Maybe if he does develop that, he could possibly become like that combo like forward center. It's really tough for me to see him ever being like a full-time five. So I think he's probably more of a four than a five for me.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, sort of just with his frame right now. Yeah, let's move on to your number 10 prospect.
For number 10, I have Liam McNeely from UConn. He's sort of your prototypical 3 and D wing. I wouldn't say his defense is like super great, but it's still good enough where I consider him to be part of that like 3 and D sort of archetype of player. He could really shoot it. The numbers don't really say that for McNeely, but his shooting form is great. It looks beautiful. It doesn't feel like he like wastes time at all with his shot. I do think he will shoot it at the NBA level, and yeah, he's sort of like one of my safe players. Like if you just want a high floor guy who does doesn't commit a lot of mistakes, who could fill a role immediately, McNeely is that guy.
Yeah, definitely, especially just with his shooting. I feel like he's one of the more plug and play players in this class, and then he does have pretty solid positional size, and then the defensive impact is certainly there as well. So for a team that's looking just to add another guy around the edges, I think he'd be a perfect fit, and he's a guy that can sort of, like you said, make a immediate impact there. So I think that's a great pick, and it's always good to sort of balance it out with high upside guys, and then guys that are more so of that plug and play type that can just immediately come in and play big minutes for you and make an impact. Just depending on what situation you are in. Even if you are one of the rebuilding teams, it's nice to have those guys that have that high floor and are able to play big minutes right away. But especially if you're a team that's in the draft, maybe like a Philadelphia 76ers team. Obviously, they don't want to be in the lottery or anything like that. Season's been super disappointing, but at the same time, with the core they have, they're really more so looking for those guys that can come right in and play big minutes. So I think McNeely's a really good fit for teams like that. Are there any other sort of teams that stand out as a good fit for McNeely?
Yeah, the immediate that comes to my mind is the Houston Rockets. That team that like they have an amazing young core that like are that super athletic, great defensive core, but they do need shooting like really badly. They're one of the worst 3-point shooting teams in the NBA. I think they're ranked like 28th or 29th at 3-point percentage. They absolutely need someone who could shoot the ball like McNeely can. I think that he's good enough defensively where like I think Ime Udoka would play him in his rookie season. So like the Rockets would be a great place for him. And I
Yeah,
would also say that the Spurs are also a good place for him as well. But from where they sit like on the draft board, it may be a bit of a reach to take him like at eighth.
yeah, those two are really good ones. That makes a lot of sense. The Rockets having that Suns pick is really huge for them, just being able to potentially add another young guy to that core. And I think McNeely would be the perfect fit, especially as you mentioned with their shooting concerns. I think he would really be ideal there, and just a guy that can play next to Şengün, play next to Jalen Green. He really fits in anywhere. So Rockets absolutely the perfect team for him. I think that's a great shout there. Let's move on to your number 11 guy. Who you got there?
My 11 guy is another Duke prospect called Knipple. Knipple, he's sort of like another indie wing. Now I would say that his defense is not great, and I don't know how it would translate into the NBA given his limited athleticism. But he could really shoot the ball. He could also be like a secondary ball handler and creator. Like he has great footwork. He could finish at the rim. He could get to the rim using that footwork and his size at like 6'7", so he could overpower maybe guard defenders. He could also pass a little bit as well. So he's probably more on the offensive end of wings, but I do think there's a lot of upside with that offense for Knipple.
Yeah, definitely. Sort of just as you mentioned, the elite shooting that he has paired with that ability to be a secondary playmaker is really huge. And then I think it was really nice to see. Obviously, it sucks that Flag got injured during that ACC tournament, but I think it's huge for Knippel's development, even though it's only 2 games. But to win that ACC tournament as sort of that lead creator, and I think he really showed a lot in those 2 games. So I was definitely impressed there. And yeah, I think he's pretty similar to McNeely, just more of that safe pick, especially just with his ability to shoot. Worst case, he's going to be that spot up shooter type of guy, but the ability to play make as well could be huge for his development, and certainly gives him a good amount of upside, especially sort of towards that later lottery range. I think that's huge, and having those bankable skill sets there is definitely going to benefit him come draft time. How do you think this tournament will sort of impact his draft stock? Could you see him as a guy that could be a big riser just with how good of a team this Duke squad is, and yeah, what do you sort of make of his March Madness?
So I think given Cooper's injury, I feel like this could be a really big opportunity for Knipple to take on more like offensive responsibility. Like if he really shows out, he could like rise, further up the draft boards. I really think that, especially given how impressive he's already been, even though it's just 2 games, but he has looked better in my eyes due to those 2 games, and I'm excited to see how he performs in the tournament.
Yeah, most definitely. Let's move on to number 12. Who you got there?
Number 12, I have Jace Richardson from Michigan State, the son of former NBA player Jason Richardson. He's probably one of my biggest risers in the draft this year. He's a very versatile guard who could play both sides of the ball. Great scorer, both on and off the ball. He could score the ball. He could shoot. He could pass a little bit. He's a good defender. Like he's just a guy that doesn't make a lot of mistakes, uh, and and has a lot of upside. The only big negative in Richardson's corner is that he's undersized at 6'3", but there's just not a lot wrong with him as a prospect. Yeah, I would not be surprised after the tournament if he goes further up my board.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely a guy that has sort of that riser potential, and the two-way impact's really huge. His scoring potential has really been awesome this year, and yeah, he was a guy that definitely wasn't super high on my radar heading into the season, but really had a stellar year at Michigan State and really soared up draft boards and really caught my eye there. And yeah, just super impressive. I feel like with this Michigan State team, they're typically more of those experienced teams, more of those 4 year players. I think the last time I remember having a lottery pick like this was the Miles Bridges era with him, Jaron Jackson Jr. as well. It's another guy, but at the same time, last few years they've been more of that experience group. So it's really nice to see another high upside freshman sort of get in the mix and have a really good season for them. Yeah, I think he's a really solid prospect. Having a dad in the NBA is always something I look at as sort of a benefit, just being around the game. I think it usually tends to help guys, and they sort of follow on the same footsteps. And he's a really good shooter as well for a Michigan State team that hasn't had a lot of great shooters this year. He's been one of the bright spots there, shooting 40% from three. So I think that's another thing to note with his game. You mentioned his size is sort of a potential concern. Do you feel like it will be necessary for him to develop more playmaking abilities to really take on that point guard responsibilities? As a 6'3" shooting guard, we have seen players be successful, but it is definitely a little bit harder. So do you feel like it's going to be necessary for him to develop a little bit more as a playmaker?
I would say that it's not, I wouldn't say it's like absolutely necessary, but it would be a very good thing for him to have. I would certainly recommend to be like just improve his overall game. He has shown like his ability to play off ball, like just makes me feel confident he'll be like a reliable guard. Yeah, so I think like it's something that he should have, but it's not like the most necessary thing.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I still feel like he does have a very high floor, just sort of like you said, the ability to play on and off the ball. I think he's going to be pretty good regardless, but I was just curious to get your take on that, just given the size concerns and sort of him being currently viewed as more of a natural two guard. But yeah, let's move on. Who you got as your number 13 prospect?
Number 13, I have Thomas Sorber from Georgetown. Rather unfortunately, he's lost for the season due to a leg injury, but in his time with the Hoyas, he has really shown out as like a two-way force at the center position. Could really protect the rim, could really just lock down the paint. Offensively, you could post up, he could serve as a cut and roll big, he could catch lobs, he could be a playmaker for others, like as like sort of like that offensive hub in the middle. And he has shown the ability to sort of like shoot mid-range jump shots. So maybe there's a possibility of him maybe shooting threes. Who knows? But uh, so there's a lot to like with Sorber.
Yeah, definitely. Another guy that wasn't necessarily on my radar heading into this season, but really jumped out. Just really exceptional season at Georgetown. Very unfortunate that his season was cut short due to injuries, but yeah, it's a lot of upside. Really good rebounder, two-way guy, so that's huge. And then the playmaking potential is always exciting. That's definitely one of my favorite archetypes of players. Playmaking bigs that can sort of be used as that offensive hub. I love watching that style of basketball. I mean, you look around the NBA, obviously Nikola Jokic jumps out as the main example of this, but then Domantas Sabonis and Alperen Şengün are two other really good examples, and those are just some of my favorite players and teams to watch around the league, so I'm always going to be drawn to guys like that. And yeah, like I do think he has a lot of upside. I think you also mentioned potential shooting. Didn't shoot the three particularly well, but I mean, most centers don't really shoot the three at a high level in college, but he does have, like you said, a nice touch and has a mid range game. So yeah, super intriguing guy. Yeah, definitely a guy who could sneak into the lottery and surprise some people. Looking around some draft boards, I feel like you are a little bit higher in Sorber than maybe other people around draft circles. What really makes you so high on him, and what makes him stand out to you?
So for Sorber, I do think it's sort of that combination of being like that two-way center, his ability to be like that rim protecting big, as well as being that sort of like the Montes Sabonis, Nikola Jokic, Şengün sort of playmaking big. Like we've seen like even at a role player level in like Isaiah Hartenstein, like how useful someone like that could be. So I think like if Sorber sort of realizes that potential, he could be like an elite, at least an elite role player league.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When we look at these centers that do have that offensive hub or playmaking abilities, a lot of times they do lack defense. So having that two-way upside is really huge, and that's going to benefit him. He was a really good rim protector and shot blocker in college, so I think that's a great pick, and he's definitely someone I'm high on heading into the draft as well. Who do you got at number 14?
At 14, I have Derek Queen from Maryland. Derek, he like he's not a defender. Like even in the sort of power forward center position, he's not a defender. Like it's good. He will struggle to defend at the NBA level. However, on the offensive end, that's where the fun begins for him because he could put the ball on the floor. He could post up. He could operate in the pick and roll. He could shoot the mid range a little bit. I don't know if he'll ever become a 3-point shooter, but if he does, it will really help his game. And also, he's a fantastic playmaker. Like the assist numbers don't do him justice. He has great court vision and feel on the offensive end, and he's a very good rebounder as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of similar to Sorber, just that potential offensive hub. Great rebounder. I think Queen for me, I'd personally have him a little bit higher. He's definitely my favorite prospect in the draft. I'm definitely higher on him than the consensus. I would probably have him top five range, but I think having him down at 14, it's definitely reasonable and more so in line with what other people are thinking. I think what really stands out for me is just his ability to create shots as well. I mean, we saw that in the Michigan game, especially. He had a massive game, and maybe that's a little recency bias for me, but just seeing that, I think it really shows the star potential that he really does have, and I think he has one of the higher upsides in this draft class. And when you look at really, this goes for Sorber as well. Versatile bigs that can really do it all, especially offensively. That archetype has proven to be very successful. We haven't seen a ton of them go within the high lottery range or even the late lottery range. I mean, Sabonis was late lottery, but when you look at like Şengün, he was mid first round. Jokic was obviously second round pick. But I feel like teams, just given the success rate in the NBA, teams should really be looking at these guys and really value them a little bit higher than they currently are being mocked. So I'm just super high on Derek Queen. I think he's going to be an absolute star in this league. The defensive concerns are certainly valid, but at the same time, when you bring so much to the table offensively, I don't think it really matters a ton. I mean, we've seen it. Obviously, I'm not saying he's going to be a Nikola Jokic type of player, but we've seen it at the highest level with Jokic, and then even with a guy like Şengün, who's not necessarily an elite defender. The Rockets have built an elite defense around him despite that. And what he brings to the table as a rebounder really helps in that area, even though he's not super impactful defensively overall. But yeah, like you mentioned, I do think he's a very underrated playmaker. Just looking at the assist numbers, it might not jump out, but he really is able to make plays for others. And he's a great screen setter as well. So I think he just brings so much to the table, and really excited to watch him in March Madness. Hopefully he goes on a deep run. That Crab 5 team is super exciting overall. So yeah, guy I'm super excited to watch March Madness and just incredibly high on. I do think fit is something that will matter a lot for him, especially just with that play style. You don't want to go to a team necessarily that has so many players just there already and has so much talent already set up. I feel like he's going to be a guy that goes to a team that really allows him to showcase his full skill set. Are there any teams that really jump out to you as an ideal fit for Queen?
I will say this would be a massive, massive reach for the Wizards, especially because they're at 2 right now. But like in terms of fit, I do like that sort of fit with Queen at the 4 and Sar at the 5, especially if Sar continues to become better as a shooter. I think him next to Sar and next to Bilal Coulibaly could really help cover up his defensive concerns. Another team I think he would fit well on would be like the Miami Heat. He like next to Bam Adebayo, like Bam isn't like a shooter, but on the defensive end, he could really, help Queen defensively, while Queen could be sort of like Queen could help fuel that Miami offense. And also there's Khalil Ware there, so there is a like a spacing big option that they could put next to Queen. Yeah, I would say those two, maybe the Spurs as well. The Spurs could also be an interesting option if they ever choose to move off of Sohan.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that Wizards fit really got me thinking. That would be fascinating to watch him with Alex Sarr, especially as Sarr's developing as a shooter, like you mentioned. I think that would be really awesome to watch. And even though the Wizards are projected to get that higher pick, they have so many future picks and they have so many assets that they could potentially end up making a trade. We saw them last year. They got 2 lottery picks, making that Denny Avdia trade, get into that 14th pick and then selected Bob Carrington. So I think that's something to monitor there. And yeah, I think that would be super fascinating to watch. Spurs as well. Him next to Wemby would just be a ton of fun, and that got really got me thinking there. That'd be a lot of fun to watch. And then the Heat is another good option, just especially with all the centers they have. I think he could really benefit playing next to them, and he can really fit in next to them. Do you feel like he needs to go to a team with a established center already and sort of run those double bigs defensively, or do you think there's a scenario where he's really sort of the only traditional center on the team, and they just surround him with a ton of good wing defenders, sort of like we saw the Rockets do with Şengün?
I feel like having that sort of like secondary big who could defend is probably like the better option, but I think there are scenarios where you could, run up at center and just put a bunch of defensive personnel next to him. Uh, like maybe, but I personally feel like since his defense is not like it's just not good enough, I feel like he would have to play more for it, like in the NBA.
Yeah, no, that's definitely valid there, and I feel like we've seen the NBA's trending towards a little more of that double big lineups, and I think that could really be the future for him. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. Even going back to the Timberwolves, the success they had with Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. Towns, in some ways, is similar to Queen in that way, as he brings so much to the table offensively. Obviously, Towns is more so of that shooter than the offensive hub type, but at the same time, it's similar in the sense that he brings so much to the table offensively, but you're going to have concerns about his defense. So really pairing him next to that elite defender is beneficial and really helps cover up his weaknesses. So I think that makes sense. And yeah, that wasn't something I had totally thought about before you said it, really pairing him with another big man, but I think that does make a lot of sense to me. Let's move on. Who you got at number 15?
At 15, I believe this is my first upperclassman in Rasheer Fleming, from St. Joseph's. He's also another big riser on my board. He had a breakout year with St. Joseph, even though that team isn't very good. He stands at 6'9". He's athletic. He could guard. He's a versatile defender. He could guard multiple positions. He could block shots. His three ball has been a major improvement to his game. I believe he shoots over 40% this year. He could be sort of like that, like 3 and D forward who's also super athletic, so he could, be like a threat in transition or when going to the basket. Yeah, he if there was any player like who's like my guy in the draft, is Rasheer Fleming.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good to know that he's sort of your guy, and yeah, like you said, he wasn't totally a guy that was super high in my draft board heading into the season. I don't think he was high in many people's, but he really just had a breakout season this year at St. Joe's, and yeah, really improved his draft stock, and it's really fun to watch sort of these mid-major guys really shoot up draft boards, and that's definitely one of my favorite parts of just draft season. And yeah, just the size that he has, and then we don't know the official measurements yet, but it looks like he has well over a 7 foot wingspan. That's going to be huge for him defensively, and just being able to make that defensive impact, can guard multiple positions, is really a bankable skill set that will translate to the NBA level no matter what. And then, as you mentioned, shooting 40% from beyond the arc is another thing that really bodes well for him, and it gives him a super high floor. So definitely one of the more exciting prospects in this class to me. And yeah, just super fun, super great story. Really excited to see where he lands in the draft. I feel like he could sneak into the lottery, and he could be a guy that, even though he's not playing in the tournament, continue to rise just because that archetype has been proven to be so successful, and it really does have such a high floor. Could you see him even rising up further despite not playing in the tournament?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the combine would be a huge a huge thing for him, especially once we get those measurements and those tests for his physical tools. I have no doubts that he's a great athlete, especially if he does well at the combine. I would not be surprised if he heads further up the boards.
Yeah, that's a great point there. I think the combine will be super huge for his draft stock, and yeah, seeing those official measurements will be super exciting just based off what we've seen so far, and it could definitely help boost his stock even further. Who you got as your number 16 prospect?
At number 16, I have Ben Seraph from Ulm. I believe that's the first international prospect, or at least the first prospect playing internationally. I have on my board. Ben Seraph, he's 6'5". He's a combo guard. He could really score the ball, especially inside the arc. He loves using his handle to break down his defender. He could hit the mid-range jump shot. He can be a playmaker. As for improvements, he will need to be able to shoot the three. I think that's a critical part of his game. It will really open up the inside for him. He's not a great athlete and not a great defensive player, but I feel like his ability to, be a sort of on-ball offensive player. I mentioned him before, but sort of like Austin Reeves in that sense. Obviously, Austin's way more advanced offensively, but someone who could be that shifty, crafty offensive guard who could really get a bucket.
Yeah, for sure. Very intriguing prospect. Not gonna lie, not someone I've really been able to tune into, unfortunately. But yeah, super intriguing just with his inside scoring, like you mentioned, and then the craftiness is certainly there. How good of a playmaker is he? That's something that I'm just a little bit curious about, especially with his size. If that sort of could be crucial in terms of determining where he goes in the draft. So just could you give a quick assessment on his playmaking?
Well, I will also say that it has been hard for me as well to like catch games or anything like that. Especially, I would say that's the same for a lot of international prospects. But for Sarah, from what I've seen, I feel like he has some pretty good court vision. He has pretty good feel to the game. He can be turnover prone, but I've seen him throw some very impressive passes. So I do think he could be sort of like a secondary creator or someone who could like come off the bench and run the bench unit in that sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense to me, and I feel like either as sort of that lead guard, or as you said, a guy that's sort of off the bench, creating plays for others. I think he's gonna probably have a successful career. I always do like that sort of bigger guard archetype. So yeah, definitely an intriguing prospect and someone who could really shoot up draft boards. I mean, we've seen it time and again with international prospects as we move closer to the draft. They end up sneaking into the lottery, and yeah, so very very interesting player, someone to certainly keep an eye on going forward. Let's move on to number 17. Who you got there?
At 17, I have Jeremiah Fears from Oklahoma. Jeremiah has been like my guy that I've been back and forth about the entire season. He could be lottery. He could be like I think he should go back to school. But like ever since like that Florida game, I like the Florida game where he scored 22 points. Even though I don't think he was very good in that sort of game. He just been looking a lot better. Especially that last game versus Kentucky where he like scored like 10 points on his own in like the last couple of minutes. His ability to like use his speed, use his handle to get into the paint, either to finish or draw a foul, is really impressive. His ability to draw a foul is an NBA skill. That's something that could be really useful for him at the next level, and he could do it really well, which is really impressive to me. He's also developing as a playmaker. He is turnover prone. But you could see him, you know, sort of feel out the game and hit people at the right spots. So I do think he would develop further as a playmaker, and he's a pretty decent rebounder for his size at 6'4". Um, the main problem areas for Fears is that he's not a 3-point shooter, which is really bad for his size, and he's gonna get picked on defensively. We saw that in that Kentucky game. We're going to see that versus UConn when Oklahoma plays them in the tournament. Fun fact, that's gonna be my matchup to watch in the first round. But I feel like if all those things come together, his ability to get into the lane and finish or draw foul, his playmaking, if he ever comes around to being at least a decent shooter, he could possibly be a star in the league. Like if all those things come around, but it's a long way to go, but I think the potential is there.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned it. I feel like this is a prospect that has sort of fluctuated on boards throughout the year, and he has been a little bit inconsistent at times, but nevertheless, just super impressive finisher, shot creator, very solid playmaker and rebounder as well, like you mentioned. Yeah, very, very intriguing player, and just a guy that super fun to watch, can really score in bunches. So I feel like that shot creation will give him a fairly high floor at the NBA level. But as you mentioned, really the shooting and defense will be crucial. He is shooting the three ball at a very inefficient rate, but at the same time, he does have a nice touch and is a good free throw shooter. So that is a good sign. What do you think will be the most important area for development for Fierce?
I absolutely think it's his shooting. Like, I think he would need to go to an environment where development is prioritized. Yeah, because his like potential is so high, he could be a star if all of those things go right for him. And I do think that there is potential for him to shoot because of his free throw numbers, because he can shoot the mid range. So like, the potential is there, and like that 3-point shooting, if it comes around, it could like really open up his game.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's almost the make or break skill for him. Not to say that he's going to be a terrible NBA player if he doesn't develop that jumper, but at the same time, he's really going to blossom as a star potentially if he's able to get that jump shot down. And yeah, really important for him. And I agree with your point there that he needs to go to a system where development is really prioritized, especially as he is more so that younger prospect. So very interested to see where he'll end up. And it's also just overall, there's so many talented guards in this class. I feel like unfortunately one of them's going to fall, but at the same time that could be good for the player or players that end up really falling down those draft boards because they can go into a system where not as much is expected of them and they can maybe make an impact on a team immediately or not play as much and learn from some more experienced guys. So I do think that's important to note. But yeah, it's very interesting to see how things shake up. And I do think March Madness could really benefit him depending on how it turns out for Oklahoma if they're able to get past UConn. Super exciting prospect matchup. We'll get into that one later. But yeah,
Hmm.
looking ahead, who you got at number 18?
At 18, I have Nolan Traore, who plays for San Quentin over in France. Nolan, he's fallen from his like top five height back in the summer, but I will say that there's still a lot to like about Traore. He's sort of like that quick twitch guard at 6'4" who could really get into the lane using his first step, his speed. His like finishing numbers ain't great, but that ability to just get into the paint is really impressive. He's a great playmaker. He has great feel, great court vision. His handle's pretty good. Obviously, I think the sort of the problem area for him is that his offensive game still needs a lot of work. He's not a 3-point shooter. He needs to really, improve upon that. While I say he's a very willing defender, he plays with a lot of energy and motor on that end. He still needs to improve like functionally as a defender. But I will say there's a lot to like with Traore, and I will also give him some leeway in the fact that he's playing in France, and it is harder on younger players to play in those professional leagues. But yeah, he's still a good prospect despite some of his shortcomings.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really great point that you brought up about how difficult it is to play overseas. I think a lot of people overlook that, but it's extremely competitive, and you're playing against real professional basketball players. It is really and truly a higher level than college. So I think that's a really good point. And yeah, it is interesting to think about. He was definitely viewed as more of that top five level prospect heading into the season, but sort of dropped. But yeah, nevertheless, I do think he has a good amount of upside, especially with his size and then sort of inside scoring. As you mentioned, a good dribbler, playmaker, things of that nature. So I do think he has a potential there. And yeah, 6'4" guard, that's always going to be an archetype that's intriguing. And then who knows how the defense will develop? As you mentioned, I do think he could end up being a quality defender, which is rare for guards, but that's something that could really benefit him moving forward. If you're looking at a team, maybe you don't have to list a specific team, but do you think it would be better for him to go into that more so developmental situation, or a team that might be looking to win now and he can sort of learn from those veterans?
Like I feel like a team like Miami would be a great place for him. I don't really know what their plans are in terms of like are they gonna make a push for the playoffs? maybe this year or next year, especially after the fallout of the Jimmy Butler trade. I feel like their developmental system could really help Traore become a quality point guard at the NBA level. I feel like a team like them would be a good place for him.
Yeah, the Heat fit really does make a lot of sense to me, especially because they do sort of lack that natural point guard. So that could be a really good one. And they're proven to be one of the best organizations in terms of developing players. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's move on to number 19 on your big board.
Number 19 is Noah Penda, who is also another French player. He stands at 6'8", I think. Actually, I think Basketball Reference has him listed at 6'6", but I think he's taller. He he's like a great defender. Probably one of the better defenders in the draft this year. Could really guard multiple positions. Could serve as a shot blocker. Could guard the perimeter. Could handle some of the bigger players. He does have potential to shoot it, even though the numbers aren't great. But I do think he sort of has that potential to shoot and become sort of like that 3-and-D forward. But it's really the defensive stuff that you're banking on with Penda. But I do think if the shooting comes around and he, keeps getting better and better overall as a player, he could really be a great role player in the future.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned the defense there and the versatility. That's always going to be a skill set that's valued and is something that could really make a guy like him shoot up draft boards, especially with how loaded this draft class is with guards. I could definitely see him as a potential riser there. I mean, we saw a few years ago Bilal Coulibaly really shot up draft boards as the draft neared and ended up going in the lottery when this time 2 years ago, Coulibaly would probably be within Penda's range or even lower. So I think that's something to note and something that's interesting just with his size and defense. I think always going to be a bankable skill set there. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And as you mentioned, that the shooting will be really crucial for his development overall. Do you see him as a potential riser just based off of that defensive impact and then sort of as we talked about the lack of really quality forwards outside of the top five or so?
I feel like Pendo is going to stay around this range, around sort of like 17 to 20, that sort of range. I don't think it's any fault of his own. I just think that there are more talented players in the draft that like the players we've already mentioned. Uh, but yeah, I would say you would just stay within this range.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense for sure. Let's close it out with your number 20 prospect. Who you got there?
So number 20, I have Carter Bryant from Arizona. Despite playing like limited minutes with Arizona, his usage in that team is kind of weird. He has been getting played more and more lately. He's 6'8", athletic, long, could shoot the three, could be a really impactful wing defender. He's very impactful defensively for Arizona. He's one of those 3-and-D wing archetype sort of players. Given his physical tools and his abilities as a shooter and as a defender, I don't see why he wouldn't go top 20. I'm not sure if he will ever take like a leap in sort of like shot make creation, but that potential to be a 3-and-D wing is like very valuable in of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Teams are always looking for those 3-and-D type of guys, so guys like Carter will always be on their radar, and I think that's a great point there. And yeah, I think it's interesting he hasn't played a ton in Arizona, but at the same time, we've seen it constantly, just how guys who necessarily haven't played a ton in college can go pretty high in the draft just based off archetype and skill set, and I think Carter really fits that mold, and his ability to shoot the three and defend allows him to sort of fit in with any lineup. So that'll be huge for his NBA potential for sure. How would you sort of compare him and Penda in terms of skill set, and then ultimately like what separates them? I know it's just one spot, but they do seem to have sort of similar games, especially defensively.
I do feel like that Panda is sort of. I feel like he's more like a 4-3, while Bryant is more like a like pure three in the sense. I do think he could guard like 2 through 4. Same with Penda, but it's sort of more like a sort of thing.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and I mean, it's just one spot, like I said, but yeah, pretty similar types of players, and yeah, super interesting prospects all around. I think you did a great job really breaking down everyone's game.